So today what I'm wanting to look at is who the people are who are portrayed in monumental brasses. As you probably know, I love monumental brasses. They're one of the things that brought me into church architecture history, so to speak. So another hobby of mine is genealogy, so the two sort of combine in this a bit. So where to start? And I suppose for me it was an isolated church in Worcestershire. The Sunday Times of the early 60s had a children's page that suggested brass rubbing as an interesting hobby. And this seemed to my parents a great way to keep us out from under my grandparents' feet on a damp day. So, armed with dusters, lining paper, heel ball and sellotape, we set off for Strensham. After some difficulty in finding it, we went in. It was cold, damp, and smelt of what my father called the odour of sanctity, an intriguing mix of dead flowers, dry rot, damp paper and rent-a-kill. But it was full of amazing things. A West End gallery covered with saints, an old font, hatchments, and a chancel cluttered with memorials of all kinds. Brasses on the walls and on the floors. I was hooked. I still have the rubbing of Sir John Russell I did that day. So who was he? Well, born in 1340, John Russell was the son of Robert Russell, whose brass lies beside his. Robert was lord of the manor of Strensham, who died in about 1390, leaving the property to John. In 1361, John married for the first time in Lavenham. His wife was Agnes, daughter of William de la Planche and Elizabeth Hilary, and they had 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. 2 died young, and the rest made advantageous marriages. We don't know much about his early career. It seems likely, however, that before he came into the family estates, he saw military service overseas. It was probably the John Russell who, in October 1373, sailed for Ireland in the company of Sir William Windsor, King's Lieutenant, and who in March 1378 was granted a lease at the Exchequer of Plumpton Hall in Northamptonshire, a property then forfeited by Windsor's wife, the notorious Alice Perrers. Before his first parliament, he was knighted, and on the 29th of March 1383, he was retained as a bachelor to Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, with an annuity of £20 in peacetime and £40 during war, as well as expenses at court for himself, a chamberlain, a groom and 3 horses when at home, and for an additional 2 grooms and 2 horses while on campaign. These were substantial allowances, indicating that he was a very useful soldier. Yet he chose to leave Beauchamp's service 4 years later in order to become a member of the royal household. And it was as a King's Knight he was granted on the 25th of November, 1387, an annuity of £50, payable at the Exchequer, in consideration of his having been retained to stay with the King for life, whereby he lost fees which he was wont to receive from his lord. Russell's desertion of Warwick couldn't have been worse timed, for the Earl was about to take over the government as one of the Lords Appellant. Yet Warwick seems to have borne him no ill will, because on the 12th of February following, while the merciless Parliament was in session, Sir John was able to obtain a royal licence to crenellate his manor houses at Strensham and Dormston. In July 1389, after Richard II had gained control, he granted him custody of the Priory of Deerhurst for the term of his life, an annual that's tax farming, of £200, from which he was permitted to deduct his annuity at source. Russell reached an agreement with the prior, enabling him to have unlimited access to the priory and accommodation there for himself and the members of his household whenever required. Sir John was evidently a skillful horseman, and is known to have taken a leading part in tournaments, such as the famous jousts held at Calais in 1390 between contenders from France and England. His prowess in this respect attracted Richard II's attention, and in 1391 he was appointed Master of the Great Horses. By 1392, he was one of a select group of only 8 knights of the chamber. From 1394 until 1395, he was in Ireland in the King's service, and in 1396, his office as Master of the Horse took him to Paris with a gift of palfreys for the French King's daughter, shortly to become Richard II's queen. Meanwhile, in 95, John had purchased property in the parish of St Mary's, Aldermanbury in London. His wife Agnes had died back in 1390, and it was about this time he took as his second wife, Margaret, the widow of a wealthy Suffolk landowner, Sir John Wingfield, beside whom she asked to be buried. This is Sir John Wingfield here. And granddaughter of Hugh Hastings of Elsing, who died in 1369, and again whose brass you can see here. And although she didn't survive for long afterwards, in 1397, after her death, he was able to obtain the wardship of Wingfield's heir, whom he later married to his own daughter Elizabeth. You see what I mean about advantageous marrying. By that date, Richard II's enemies were under arrest and due to be judged in the forthcoming Parliament, to which Richard Russell himself had been elected after an absence from the Commons of 18 years. Besides being a party to the judgments passed there, he also benefited personally from the forfeiture of the Earl of Warwick's estates. So it paid off leaving Warwick. By grants made at the end of September, he received, in lieu of an additional annuity of 25 marks, which he'd been promised for his gratuitous good service, the manors of Earls Crewham and Bourton, and holdings in Strensham and Eckington. Why this was so is uncertain, for he was evidently as much in royal favour as they were, but perhaps he had a personal disinclination or thought it imprudent to become rich through Warwick's downfall. As master of the horse, he had responsibility of taking over the stables of the condemned men. But at Shrewsbury, on the last day of Parliament in 1398, he obtained a discharge from his office, and in consideration of his good and gratuitous service, a pardon of any arrears due on his accounts. It was also conceded he need not take up any further office against his will, and notwithstanding his indenture of retainer, which bound him to do so, he shouldn't be compelled to take part in any military expeditions either at home or overseas. This left him free for tasks of a more important nature. On the very same day, he was appointed to the committee of 12 lords and 6 commoners, authorised to finish the uncompleted business of the Parliament, and more specifically to look into charges of treason made one against the other by Henry of Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray. The committee met at intervals in the course of the year, with Russell, by now also an official member of the King's Council, a very active participant. At Christmas 1398, he was granted the marriage of Elizabeth, daughter and heiress of William Planch of Havisham in Buckinghamshire. She was a wealthy widow with 3 husbands, Sir John Birmingham, Robert Grey, and John Clinton. She was also heiress of the childless elder sister of Catherine, the widow of Bernard Brocas. Elizabeth was an heiress in her own right, having inherited from her parents the manors of Compton Chamberlain, Claybrook, and Havisham. And she also brought with her 3 dowers from her first marriage. So all of a sudden, the Russells really are becoming incredibly wealthy. There was massive legal dispute about Russell's acquisition of all this wealth, but he promised that he would take a certain amount and then would not trouble the family anymore. Russell proved an industrious and active councillor throughout 1398 and up till Richard's departure for Ireland in 1399. Then he and his fellows were left with great responsibilities for the administration of the country during the king's absence. When news came of Henry of Bolingbroke's landing in Yorkshire, they were consulted by the Duke of York as to the best course of action, and immediately advised the removal of the government to St Albans. Sir John hurriedly raised troops for the Duke's army, but York made his peace with Bolingbroke, and Sir John was forced to flee for his life. Surprisingly, he escaped being taken prisoner or executed, and the only strict measure taken against him seems to have been his removal from the keepership of Darehurst Priory, on the grounds that the possessions are dissipated and the divine service is not held on account of his infirmities. Indeed, when Henry mounted the throne, he showed considerable leniency towards Russell. The latter was allowed to keep the issues of the Priory estates up to Michaelmas, and apparently also to retain the Earl of Warwick's manor of Earls Crewham. Furthermore, he remained on the Worcestershire bench, and the king upheld his wife's rights over properties. In August 1401, he was one of just 3 men summoned from Worcestershire to attend a great council. So there was no hint of retribution against him for his activities in the last 2 years of Richard's reign, and it's perhaps proof that he was respected as a man of moderate opinion and temperament. In his few remaining years, he made settlements of his estates, provided for his inheritance, and generally set things to rights. He made his will on the 7th of April, 1404, and requested burial in the chancel of Strensham Church. which he instructed his executors to have enlarged, using the sum of £20 supplied for that purpose. His tomb was to have a monumental brass depicting him with his 3 wives, and 1,200 masses were to be said for his soul. Sadly, his heirs seem to have had other views on the brass. He stands alone under a canopy, and the master marbler economized by reworking an earlier large brass of a lady. That one of the largest sums of money he left, £20, was to be spent on works in the chancel of Deerhurst Priory, is indicative of his affection for that place. So he finally died in 1405, and his body was brought back to Strensham for burial. So that first brass I ever rubbed led me down a rabbit hole of medieval politics. So, brasses were part of my childhood, and that one brass led me straight down this rabbit hole. So we fast forward to joining Sophie's classes. In my second year, I drew this church as one to guide the class round looking at its furnishings, Wensley Church. Not quite so isolated as Strensham, but still a bit out of the way, and both incidentally now maintained by Churches Conservation Trust, though neither of them were when I first visited them. It's another mine of amazing stuff. Wall paintings, woodwork, a medieval poor box, one of the most OTT pews ever, and a brass. So meet Simon of Wensley, the rector of Wensley in the 14th century. The first thing we notice is his prestigious place in the chancel. He's clearly not only a priest, but a respected and wealthy one. This picture is reinforced by his superb vestments, lavish silk cushion, and fashionable poulain shoes. Simon de Wensley seems to have been a notable local worthy, well thought of and well bred. His family was connected with the local aristocratic family, the Scroops, and he was baptized with a Scroop family name, Simon, somewhere about 1320. We first meet Sir Simon in 1352, where Henry de Bellaby put Simon de Wenslaw, clerk, together with John Husthwaite, clerk, and Philip de Fulford, chaplain, in trust for the whole of his manor of Walburn. Soon after this, Robert Scroop of Bolton gave Simon the valuable and important rectory of Wensley. As rector, he would be expected to take an active part in the affairs of the landed classes in the area. He was closely involved with the Scroop family, possibly as their legal advisor, and throughout the 1360s, he was involved in various land cases on their behalf. We next meet him in 1386, now aged over 60, when he appears as a key witness in the celebrated case of Scroop versus Grosvenor, one of the earliest cases about the ownership of a coat of arms. Both he and the Abbot of Easby affirm in their claims that Wensley Church and Easby Abbey are covered in Scroop heraldry, all dating from before the memory of man. His patron won the day, and the Grosvenors were forced to redesign their coat of arms. Presumably Simon died soon after. He's not mentioned in Lord Scroop's will of 1400, and this definitely suggests that he was dead by then. What is clear is that on his death, there was plenty of money to ensure that his memory lived on. Maybe Lord Scroop financed this and set out to ensure that his man had nothing but the best. But more likely, Sir Simon had already put matters in hand for himself, and that his monument was already made well before his death. No local work for him. He could have followed the example of the hugely unpopular Bishop of Durham, Louis de Beaumont, who purchased a vast slab of Frosterley marble, some 16 by 10 foot, had an enormously elaborate brass set in it, probably by a York marbler, in 1335, and had it set before the altar in the choir of Durham Cathedral, now just covered by the carpet in front of the altar, you can see in that photograph. Instead, the memorial for Sir Simon was commissioned and imported, both stone and brass, from Tournai in Flanders. Oh, sorry, I've gone past. Probably Sir Simon visited Tournai himself to select a marbler whose work he liked the look of. Perhaps he saw some of Lothar Hannet's work in the cathedral there, such as the retable, donated by Canon Simon de Portail. Possibly the two priestly Simons discussed the matter of memorials together. Almost certainly Sir Simon would have visited Lothar's workshop on the Quai Taille Pierre at Tournai. The streets still exist today, though none of the medieval houses survive in their original states. What we do know for certain is that in 1345, Simon de Portail commissioned a brass for himself and his brother Jean, also canon of Tournai. The monument was to be a tomb covered with copper alloy, Latin, exactly the same in all dimensions and quality to that of Jacquemont de Corbry. The tomb should have effigies of 2 priests, highly decorated, and the background should be left unenameled. In exchange for this work, Lothair would receive 120 Tournai pounds. That's about 2 million in modern money. However, Canon Simon did not die until 1362, and the brass presumably sat gathering dust in the workshop till then. By this time, the brothers had moved to Paris, and only then was the inscription engraved and the brass sent to the Church of the Chartreux and installed. Sadly, it doesn't survive, but a drawing made of the 19th century records it. Now, when we look at the Wensley brass, it seems fairly clear that this is from the same workshop. Here, the order seems to have been for a figure cut to shape in the English style and slightly less heavily ornamented than the Paris brass. Common to both are the strangely folded hands underneath the chalice. It's a unique pose to these 2 brasses, angels supporting the cushions on which the head rests, and the 2 little dogs under the feet. Another contract in which Lothair was involved in the 1330s speaks of him as part of a team to produce a brass set in stone 11 foot by 5 foot. The other 2 men are Jean d'Escamin, specialist marble worker, and Jean de la Croix, brass founder. So quite probably these men would have provided the Latin and the large slab of Tournai marble for the Wensley Commission. What also makes clear is the amazing amount of money available to the rector of what is today a tiny and obscure village. A comparable single-figure brass of 1311 cost 100 Tournai pounds, again, somewhere in the region of 2 million, half of which was payable in advance. It's inconceivable today to think of a rural vicar spending millions on his burial. So the brass that rekindled my interest in brasses actually gives us a unique insight into who's responsible for these amazing monuments. So now I want to look at some more of the fascinating lives that lie behind these monuments, some famous, some not so much. Though they begin with the earliest brass and finish with the very late one, they're going to be in a fairly random order, but hopefully there's a flow of some sort. So we start with the Prince Bishop of Verden. The earliest brasses have survived in continental Europe, and the earliest of all these is that to Bishop Iso de Volpe, born about 1170, who rose to a position of considerable power in the early 13th century Holy Roman Empire. From 1205, as Prince Bishop of Verden, a town in what's now the northwest German state of Lower Saxony, he wielded great spiritual and secular authority during a time of immense political and religious tumult. In his role as Prince Bishop, he enjoyed imperial immediacy, meaning he was an elector of the Holy Roman Emperor, and by default operated largely independently of the Emperor, and to an extent the Pope. So he would have had pretty much the same authority in his area as the Emperor and the Pope, and could, will, overrule them. Born the younger son of Count Bernard von Volpe from the county of Volpe, he entered the clergy at an early age and was a canon in Verden by 1188. In 1205, he was elected Bishop of Verden. At first, he supported the Dukes of Swabia in the complex politics of the period, but after his father's death, and pressured by his elder brother Bernard, he transferred his allegiance to Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. Between 1211 and 1215, he took part in political and missionary excursions in Livonia during the period of truce in the Livonian Crusade. After Otto's death in 1218, Iso gained imperial immediacy, this privileged constitutional and political status under which the imperial estates of the Holy Roman Empire, such as imperial cities, prince-bishoprics, and individuals such as the imperial knights, were declared free from the authority of any local lord and placed under the direct authority of the Holy Roman Emperor for parts of his diocese, thus establishing the Prince-Bishopric of Verden, and enabling him to establish the collegiate monastery of St. Andreas in Verden, which you can see in the background there, in 1220. Immediately, he had the northern city of Verden fortified with a curtain wall. The fortification and the start of minting coinage led to Verden quickly gaining city rights. Under Iso, Verden distanced itself from imperial politics, and the monastery expanded its territory by restricting the power of the nobility. In 1226, he was in dispute with the Archbishop of Bremen about spiritual jurisdiction, but soon after, he gave up lordship of the city and relinquished control of the monks' goods. After endowing the new cathedral in Verden, he died in 1231. his brass in St Andrew's Church, so dressed in full liturgical vestments. He has a crozier as a symbol of the bishop's role as shepherd of his flock, and in each hand he holds a model of a building. In his right hand, you can see St Andrew's Church, which he founded in 1220, and in his left, the city wall of Verden, which he commissioned during his episcopate and demarcated what would later become the town's boundaries. Hardly any other Verden bishop has left such clear marks on his city. Considerable part of the first city wall that he built have been preserved to this day. St Andreas Church, the church of the clerical monastery of the same name, which he founded here, together with the cathedral, also survive. So from one continental aristocrat to another, we move to royalty, a group of whom very few brasses survive. This spectacular Flemish brass of 1319 at Ringsted Cathedral in Denmark commemorates King Erik Menved and his wife Ingeborg. The magnificent appearance of this monument entirely obscures the unstable lives and times which existed at this period. Eric's father and grandfather were both assassinated while on the throne. It's thought his grandfather, Christopher I, whose fine indent is recently rediscovered, was poisoned while taking communion at Ribe Cathedral. His father, Erik Gipping, succeeded to the throne at the age of 10, whilst Erik was all of 12 when he was crowned in 1286, when his father was murdered by unknown assailants. On account of his age, his mother ruled for him till 1294. His early reign was led by his mother and her German relatives, and the first act of the new government was to settle the case of the former king's murder at a court convened in 1287. After a one-day trial, the jury found all the accused guilty. Their properties and income were declared forfeit, and they were exiled from Denmark on pain of death, and excommunicated by the Pope to boot. The verdict was questionable on several counts. None of the accused could be proved to be in the immediate vicinity when the king was stabbed to death. The accused were not allowed to swear their innocence before the court. They had all belonged to Eric V's inner circle. It's uncertain what they were supposed to gain by the king's death. The murder was probably the result of a power struggle between two noble factions, or a dynastic struggle for the throne of Denmark, an idea underlined by the welcome the condemned received from Eric of Norway, a prime contender for the Danish throne. It was the start to 4 decades of conflict and warfare between the Nordic kingdoms. The ambitious new Archbishop of Lund supported the outlaws, his kinsmen, despite his oath to support the king. The king, newly freed from his mother's authority, couldn't tolerate this and ordered the Archbishop's arrest in 1294. After 2 years in awful conditions, Bishop Jens managed to escape and fled directly to Rome to lay his case before the Holy See. The Pope immediately excommunicated the king and put all of Denmark under interdict for 4 years. In 1302, King Eric wrote to the Pope asking for mercy for himself and the kingdom, which had been without any of the sacraments for years. Promising to do whatever the Pope said, King Eric humbled himself in public. Eric had married Ingeborg Magnusdotter of Sweden in June 1296, the daughter of King Magnus III of Sweden. The couple had 8 sons who died as children, as well as at least 6 miscarriages. In 1318, Ingeborg finally gave birth to a son, and according to tradition, was so happy to finally have a live-born child, she took the boy out for a carriage ride to show him off, holding him out of the window, where she lost her grip on him and he fell and broke his neck. Queen Ingeborg subsequently entered the convent of St Agnes in Roskilde, where she died the following year. Eric had a great love of tournaments and money. Money poured out of the treasury for his entertainments. He crafted new and unusual taxes to squeeze peasants and nobles alike. When the tax money didn't cover his expenses, the king borrowed money heavily from various German nobles, going so far as to mortgage pieces of Denmark to them. In 1312, famine struck Denmark, and when the king demanded the same taxes as before, the peasants on Zealand rebelled. Eric put down the rebellion fiercely, hanging hundreds of peasants outside Copenhagen. The very next year, the peasants and nobles declared open rebellion against the king. Those who refused to aid the rebels were hanged from their own house beams. Eric put down the rebellion with mercenary troops from Germany, which cost a pretty penny. From 1315 to 1317, the crops failed again. There was nothing left to tax. The treasury was empty. In 1317, Eric mortgaged all of the island of Funen for 200 mounted knights. Before he died, Eric also mortgaged Skåne to German nobles for money to continue his extravagances. When Eric died in 1319, having survived all his 14 children, Denmark was bankrupt. It's quite surprising that his heir and brother Christopher, who had opposed him in a lot of his expenditure, paid for such an elaborate and expensive memorial. Right, we now move to the earliest brass in England to a woman. This is Margaret de Camoys, and her superb brass by Adam of Corfe is at Trotton in West Sussex. Now, she was born Margaret de Breuse around 1290, probably at Bramber Castle in Sussex, the daughter of William de Breuse, Lord of Breuse in Normandy, Bramber and Gower, and his third wife, Mary de Ross. William's mother was a daughter of Llewellyn ap Ionwerth, the Prince of Wales, and his father was a descendant of one of the Norman barons present at the Battle of Hastings. Mary was the daughter of Robert de Ross of Helmsley. Now, Margaret is first recorded in the 1280 case between her ever-litigious father and Messire de River concerning the inheritance of Chesworth, Grinstead and Bidlington in Sussex. She's noted again living with her parents in Swansea Castle in 1290 during the case of Richard Crach. Now, Richard Crach took part in a Welsh rebellion against Edward I in 1287 and was taken prisoner in 1290 by one of Margaret's brothers. He was taken to Swansea Castle, accused of killing 13 men. His friends and family rallied round to offer 100 cows for his release, but the offer was refused. He pleaded innocence, but was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged. Along with another rebel, Crach was hanged on a hill in sight of Swansea Castle. His companion was a large man who struggled a great deal as he was hauled up from the ground by his neck, causing the crossbeam of the gallows to break. Although the executioner considered both men to be already dead when they fell to the ground, they were strung up again, and the two men were left swinging from the gallows. Crach's body, by now clearly and revoltingly dead, was cut down some 8 hours later and sent into the town at the request of Margaret's mother. Now, why Mary de Breuse was so interested in Crach is unclear. She had asked for his reprieve, she'd asked for him to be cut down, and finally demanded his corpse. Lady Mary had a special devotion to Thomas of Cantilupe, the deceased Bishop of Hereford, and in her own words, on bended knee, she asked Thomas de Cantilupe to ask God to restore life to William Crach. Lady Mary sent her daughter Margaret to measure Crach's body with a length of thread, implying a promise to offer the saint a candle the length of the person on whose behalf the saint was being asked to intercede. Crach's recovery began the day after his hanging, but it was some time before he was able to stand unaided. He was summoned to appear at Swansea Castle before Lord and Lady de Breuse. Crach explained that as he was being taken to the gallows, he prayed to Thomas Cantilupe to save him, and that as he was hanging from the gallows, a bishop dressed all in white appeared and saved him by supporting his feet. Once he was sufficiently recovered, Crach undertook a pilgrimage to Hereford, accompanied by Lord and Lady de Breuse, to thank Cantilupe for restoring his life. He walked barefoot on the 3-day trip, wearing the rope he'd been hanged with around his neck. This miracle was one that led to the formal canonization of Thomas Cantilupe. So sometime before 1303, she married Sir Ralph de Camoy, first Baron Camoy, and they had 3 sons. Ralph was already Baron of Flockthorpe Manor and Beckerton Manor in Norfolk. He was heir to his father's and his mother's estates, and in 1311, on his mother's death, also succeeded to her marriage portion, consisting of the manor in Elsing, Hampshire, and half a manor in Lasham, also in Hampshire. He appears to have come of age in 1305, when he did homage for Flockthorpe Manor, and the next year was knighted with Prince Edward and many others by bathing and other sacred ceremonies. In other words, he becomes a knight of the bath. Margaret brought as a marriage portion a quarter of the knight's fee in Effingham, together with the manor of Little Bookham adjoining it, together with the manor of Woolbedding in Sussex. In 1303, her mother installed them in Bookham Parva, he in returning installing his mother-in-law in Flockthorpe Manor to hold for his wife. In 1306, Ralph and his wife Margaret re-granted Bookham Parva Manor with the lands in Effingham to Lady Mary de Breuse on her death, again obtaining the lands. In 1316, He was lord of 3 manors in Norfolk, 3 in Hampshire, 8 in Sussex, including Trotton, and 3 in Northamptonshire. It's probable that he built the present church of Trotton, which dates from about this period. He seems to have been a typical landowner of the period, enthusiastically raising game and prosecuting poachers and those who felled his trees without permission. He exercised his rights to appoint clergy in the churches on his lands and was holding weekly markets and fairs. In 1307, Ralph and Margaret were summoned to attend the coronation of Edward II, representing the county of Sussex in the train of the King and Queen. The next year, and apparently again in 1310, Ralph was summoned to perform military service against the Scots, and seems to have been taken prisoner at the Battle of Bannockburn, because as in 1312, he has to fell trees to the value of 1,000 marks to pay his ransom. The following year, he received letters of protection until midsummer next, while undertaking a pilgrimage to Santiago. We don't know if Margaret accompanied him, probably not. He was summoned to Parliament from 1313 to 1335 and became Constable of Windsor Castle for 4 years in 1319. In 1316, he had obtained license during pleasure to hunt the fox and the hare, fence time accepted in the royal forests in counties of Northants, Huntingdonshire, and Hampshire. In 1319, he again obtained letters of protection while making a pilgrimage to Santiago, and then was appointed governor of Windsor Castle and warden of the forest, which post he held till the end of the reign of Edward II. In 1322, he was enjoined to take as many men-at-arms and foot soldiers as he could and appear at Coventry with them on the first Sunday in Lent, to proceed against the rebels and adherents of the Earl of Leicester. Margaret must have died soon after this, as in 1324, the manor of Cookham in Sussex was settled on Ralph and his second wife, Elizabeth. So she is a real aristocrat. She actually seems to marry down a bit, but lives a very wealthy and comfortable life, punctuated by law disputes, and has the most beautiful brass. Now then, this is a self-made man. This brass is at Higham Ferrers, and it commemorates William and Beatrix Chichele. William was the eldest son of Thomas Chichele of Higham Ferrers and brother of Henry Chichele, the Archbishop of Canterbury. By February 1390, he'd married Beatrix, by whom he had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Although overshadowed by their younger brother Henry, who rose from relatively humble origins to become Archbishop of Canterbury, William and his brother John became grocers in London, and they enjoyed considerable influence on their own account. Their father Thomas was a man of some consequence at Higham Ferrers, but very much parochially. He was mayor of the town, and in 1386 was made a subsidy collector for the county. Thomas was a draper, and his brother Walter was an influential member of the Drapers' Company. The connection may well explain why Thomas Chichele's 2 elder sons chose to enter the world of commerce, and perhaps did much to ensure their early success in the city. We first hear of William in 1373, when he was already a full member of the Grocers' Company. He continued to play an active part in its affairs for the next 45 years, though his name doesn't occur outside the company records till 1384, where he represents Cheapward on the Common Council of the city. Shortly after, he became warden of the Grocers' Company and was returned to Parliament in 1397 as one of the members for the City of London, though he seems to have employed his younger brother Robert, also later a member of Parliament, to attend out-of-town meetings of the Parliament on his behalf. He still picked up the expenses, though. Like most grocers, he dealt in apothecaries' goods, and in 1398 we find him supplying medicines for the household of Henry of Bolingbroke. As committed Lancastrians, all 3 Chichele brothers welcomed Henry's accession to the throne in 1399, and in various degrees each benefited from it. In July 1413, he and Thomas Burton, another London grocer, had a royal license to export wool from England, and next year they were allowed to ship grain into the country from Spain and Portugal. Over his career, he acquired property in both London and the country. From his father, he inherited a house and land in Higham Ferrers, being already the owner with his wife of a sizable property in Stanwell, Middlesex. And it was here that he drew up his will 36 years later. William owned the manor of West Ham, which he and his wife settled on new fees in 1425, not long before his death, and had property in the Diocese of Winchester, perhaps in Suffolk, since in 1388 he obtained a license from the bishop to make use of a private oratory while living there. In the city, he had a brewery called the Castle on the Hoop and 2 shops in the parish of St Margaret, Friday Street. He owned 2 more tenements in the parish of St Nicholas Cole Abbey and St Mary Monshall, together with a shop in Old Fish Street, placing him among the wealthier citizens of London. In 1409, he became Sheriff of London. His rise to a position of importance in the city owed little, if anything, to his brother's success in the church, though at a later date, he and his 2 sons enjoyed the fruits of nepotism. It's a mark of Chichely's personal standing that as early as 1398, he and his wife obtained papal indults for the plenary remission of sins at the hour of death. 2 years later, he was one of the leading citizens of London to petition Parliament for an inquiry into certain malpractices and extortions committed by the sheriffs. His elder son, William, was in fact the first to profit directly from Henry's spectacular rise to archbishop. Though still a minor, he was made Chancellor of Salisbury Cathedral soon after his uncle surrendered the post in 1409. Chichely himself was meanwhile provided for in 1416 with the stewardship of the Archbishop's liberty, an office which on his death passed to his second son, John, with an annuity for life of 40 marks. Not much is known about his later years, largely because he seems to have retired gradually from civic life. He was one of the keepers of the fabric of St Dunstan's in the East till at least 1417, and served as an alderman for another 3 years or so. He died sometime between May 1426 and July 1427, and was buried at Higham Ferrers next to his parents. He left a substantial part of his London property to the College of Priests, which his brother had recently founded there. He left 2 daughters and a son, whose spendthrift ways caused many problems to the family and must have blighted his father's last years. John Chichely, whose marriage was extraordinarily prolific, even by 15th century standards, eventually managed to regain a degree of financial equilibrium and even had a hand as city chamberlain in managing the reserves of money held in the common chest. So this monument can be seen as a fitting tribute to a man who came from a reasonably prosperous background in local affairs, but managed to rise to national governments and wealth before returning to his roots in death. This chap, however, this is another politician, he was Speaker of the House, but he is definitely not a self-made man. He was born in 1415, John Say, member of the gentry. He was the son of John Say and his wife Maud. And his brother, William, was the Dean of the Chapel Royal and Dean of St Paul's. Little is known of his early life. He owned land in Broxbourne and Sawbridgeworth in Hertfordshire. And in 1446, he married Elizabeth, daughter and heir of Lawrence Cheney of Fenditton in Cambridgeshire. And they settled at Broxbourne. He trained as a lawyer and soon rose to prominence, becoming King's Sergeant, Keeper of Westminster Palace, and eventually a Privy Councillor. In 1447, he entered Parliament as MP for Cambridge, and in 1449 was elected Speaker. He was soon made Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and Sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk. Say was maligned and embroiled in much controversy during his life. In 1451, his name was included among a number who the House of Commons prayed to be removed from the presence of Henry VI. John was indicted for treason. However, he was pardoned in 1452, and in 1469 was appointed with William Erswick to inquire into the state of the coinage and certain alleged abuses at the Royal Mint. He also managed to successfully switch sides from the House of Lancaster to that of York and survived. From 1453 to 1478, he represented Hertfordshire in several parliaments, and again was chosen to serve as Speaker, and later became the Keeper of the Great Wardrobe and made Knight of the Bath in 1465. In late 1446, he married Elizabeth, the widow of Sir Frederick Tilney. Born in 1423, she was daughter of Lawrence Cheney, another leading political figure in East Anglia. By dint of her 2 marriages, she was the great-grandmother of Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and Catherine Howard, 3 of the wives of Henry VIII. She had 1 daughter by her first husband, Sir Frederick Tilney, Elizabeth Tilney, who married Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, who became the 2nd Duke of Norfolk, and had 9 children, and these children included Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, Elizabeth Howard, mother of Anne Boleyn, and Edmund Howard, father of Catherine Howard. John and Elizabeth had 7 children, including Anne, who married Henry Wentworth, whose children included Marjorie Wentworth, a noted beauty and mother of Jane Seymour. Elizabeth died on the 2nd of September 1473, and before the 9th of October 1474, John married Agnes Danver, an elderly widow who did not long survive him. He died in 1478 and was succeeded by his son William, who became MP and Sheriff for Hertfordshire. John and Elizabeth are buried together at Broxbourne. Say had contracted the mason Robert Stowell to extend the south aisle and prepare a tomb for them both in 1476. The brass is set on a low altar tomb, positioned on the south side of the chancel, and shows him in armour, and it's a very heavily enamelled brass. It gives an idea of what an expensive piece of monument this is. So we move to Rise and Fall of Court. There's a connection between this chap and the previous one. This is Thomas Bullen, Earl of Wiltshire and Knight of the Garter, the father of Anne Boleyn, who died in 1537, has a fine brass on his tomb in Hever Church, shown in his full regalia as a Garter Knight and an Earl. His feet rest on a griffin, no mere lion for him. He was born about 1477 at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, the son of Sir William Bullen of Blickling, by his wife Margaret Butler, a daughter and co-heiress of Thomas Butler, 7th Earl of Ormond. William was a wealthy and powerful landowner, originally of the merchant class, High Sheriff of Kent, who was created Knight of the Bath at the coronation of Richard III in 1483, and was charged by Henry VII with responsibility for the beacons that used to warn in an event of attack. At some time before 1499, Thomas married Lady Elizabeth Howard, eldest daughter of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk, and they had 5 children, only 3 of whom survived children. These were Mary, who was at one time mistress to Henry VIII, George, the eldest surviving son, who was executed in 1536, and Anne, the second wife of Henry VIII. Elizabeth was the granddaughter of Lady Elizabeth Say, who featured on the last brass. In 1503, Thomas showed his talent for diplomacy, helping to escort Margaret Tudor north for her marriage with James IV of Scotland, and he was created a Knight of the Garter at the coronation of Henry VIII. He then became ambassador to the Low Countries, where his daughter Anne was maid of honour to the Archduchess of Austria. And through his ability and connections with the extended family, he became one of Henry VIII's leading diplomats and helped organise the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Through his title, he had long squabbles about which titles he was able to retain. And after much litigation, he did succeed to the title of Earl of Ormond. He was sent as an envoy to a meeting of the Holy Roman Emperor and Charles V to seek support for the marriage annulment of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and was appointed Lord Privy Seal in 1530. And then in 1532, his daughter Anne was created Marquess of Pembroke in her own right, before marrying Henry the following year. Boleyn acquiesced in Anne's execution, taking part in the secret commission to inquire about Anne's supposed sexual misconduct and treason against the king. At this point, he was replaced as Lord Privy Seal and for a time fell from favour. However, he gradually climbed his way back to a degree of royal favour. He helped crush the rebels with the Pilgrimage of Grace and was present at Prince Edward's baptism in 1537. And he finally died in 1539, at which point Henry VIII paid £16, 13 shillings and 4pence to his chaplain, the Dean of Windsor, for certain orisons, suffrages and masses to be said for the soul's health of the Earl of Wiltshire, late deceased. So Henry came to respect him again. This is another of that family. This little figure is Anne Astley, and she's buried at Blickling, and it shows her with 2 swaddled babies in her arms. On the brass, she's dressed in a maternity dress, slashed down to the waist. This is something that's incredibly rare, a very rare glimpse of clothing adapted for pregnancy. She was the daughter of John Wood of East Barsham. She became the second wife of Thomas Astley of Melton Constable about 1505, They had 4 children, John, Anne, Elizabeth, and Margaret, before her death in childbirth with twins, a boy and a girl, who after a hazardous birth departed suddenly to the Lord on the day of St. Agatha, martyr, in the year of our most bounteous Christ, 1512. Anne's sister Elizabeth was married to James Bullen, Thomas's brother, of Blickling Hall. And it seems she was visiting her sister at Blickling when she must have gone into early labour. She was probably unaware she was expecting twins. On arrival, John remarried Frances Cheney and had a further son, Isaac, before he died in 1534. And this is their son, John, who married Cat Ashley, who was Elizabeth I's governess. This is Eleanor de Bourgh, who married Thomas Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, born about 1355 at Woodstock Palace, the youngest son of Edward III. They were given Pleshy Castle in Essex, and Thomas was appointed Constable of the Realm for rebelling and ending up executed. Yes, he was sent to France and came back and became one of the Lords Appellant, who eventually, and this is what happened to him, he ended up strangled. He was being summoned back to be tried for treason, but certain aristocrats decided that they would do the job themselves. And so he was strangled with his bed linen in Calais. This didn't stop him having an absolutely spectacular brass in Westminster Abbey, which unfortunately doesn't survive. As he was attainted as a traitor, his dukedom of Gloucester was forfeit. The title Earl of Buckingham was inherited by his son, who died in 1399, only 2 years after his death. These events left Eleanor without status, and shortly afterwards she withdrew to Barking Abbey as a nun. She assured her children's future by rendering homage to Richard II for her lands, and thereby receiving an annuity from the king. She died on the 3rd of October, 1399, reputedly of grief for her only son, and was buried in Westminster Abbey next to her husband. These two chaps in Little Hawksley Church are Robert Swinburne and his son Thomas, who died in 1413. These were aristocrats whose family came from Northumberland, but they acquired land all over the show. Robert was a professional soldier. In 1355, he took part in the Black Prince's expedition to Gascony, culminating at Poitiers, and it was while overseas he was knighted. He saw further military service abroad in 1366 and 1369. Such experience was put to use by the government in the early years of Richard II's reign, and he was entrusted with the defence of Harwich. From 1377 till his death, he represented Essex in Parliament, and in 1380 was required to help restore order in the southeast after the peasants' revolt. His son was also a professional soldier, and again represented Essex in Parliament after his father. And he died in 1391, shortly before the Parliament that he was called to assembled. He was buried in Little Hawksley Priory in the tomb which his son, William, ordered to be built on the model of the royal tombs in Westminster Abbey. I shall kick straight through an awful lot of complicated politics to a church much closer to home, Calthorpe. This is a brass in Calthorpe from about 1470 and shows one Brian Radcliffe precariously balancing the church he endowed in one hand. Various other disordered bits and pieces are scattered around. However, the Victoria and Albert catalogue of 1915 has this picture of a rubbing of the same brass, done before somebody ran off with his wife, not to mention the church tower, and the whole ensemble got disarranged. As can be seen from an old drawing, they once stood under a double canopy with 8 shields, 5 of which survived till the 19th century. All the rest was stolen when the church was robbed in 1841, at a time when the brass was virtually complete, though suffering In a most disgraceful state of neglect, the canopy is much mutilated, many fragments with escutcheons of arms now in the parish chest, while a stove has been placed on the gravestone slab. As the photograph shows, the brass is a pretty good representation of the church. It hasn't changed a huge amount, though the large window has been replaced. Around the arches of the canopy were Latin verses from the Office of the Dead, and between their feet is a bier with a fringed pall, and a shield with the arms of Burr, referring to Brian's maternal uncle, who left in the manor. At the bottom of the canopy columns are on Brian's side standing dishes, referring to Joan's great-grandmother, a daughter of Sir Robert Standish, and on Joan's side, chess piece, rooks, taken from the arms of Rookcliffe. He was the eldest of the 4 sons of Guy Rookcliffe of Escrick, Recorder of York, and he married Joan, the daughter of Sir Richard Hamilton of Wigglesworth in Craven. He was promoted to 2nd Baron of the Exchequer by Richard III, whose coronation he officiated in 1483, and was later granted the manor of Fawcett in North Riding. After the death of Richard III, his successor Henry VII kept him as 2nd Baron, and he remained Commissioner of the Peace in the 1480s. His judicial functions did not prevent him taking on other legal work, and he frequently acted as counsel for his own son, John Routcliffe, who was involved in protracted litigation over the Plumpton estates. A very complicated family law case. And there he is as counsel in the Exchequer. In 1455, Sir Brian, as patron of the church, petitioned Archbishop Booth to allow him to pull down the old church and erect a new one, at his own expense, in a place more convenient for the parishioners, who were meanwhile attending services in the Manor House Chapel, and the new church was consecrated in 1458. Planned as his family mortuary chantry, the chancel of the new church had much of their heraldry and shields of arms in the windows, recording their ancestry through 4 generations. He also gave the richly carved Easter sepulchre, again decorated with his coat of arms. As well as his brass here, Sir Brian also commissioned a brass to be placed in the Temple Church, London. This was lost many centuries ago and was never recorded, though we do have his instructions. I will that James Reams, marbler in Paul's Churchyard, London, make my epitaph in the temple, and be paid the 10 shillings still owing to him. After all the trouble he went to at Cowthorpe, it seems a touch odd that Sir Brian, in his will, asked to be buried in the Greyfriars in York, near the altar of the Trinity. But as there is no record of a tomb or monument to him there, he's probably buried here under this brass, which was erected in his lifetime. And I think at this point, we're going to have to draw to an end. We might get a second instalment in the autumn of more of these people, because they are utterly fascinating. At least I find them so. I hope you haven't been bored to tears by too much politics. So at that point, we will call it a day, if I can find a way to stop sharing. It's just, for me, it's when you suddenly stop looking at them as just bits of churches and you see them as people, it's a whole different way of looking at them.
Amazing the research that you've done into them.
Well, this is where my genealogy comes in useful. I'm used to knowing where to look.
Mm.
There is an utterly wonderful website of the history of the Houses of Parliament, which basically, as far as I can see, gives potted biographies of every MP there has ever been.
Oh, really?
It's absolutely amazing.
But I mean, that pass, as you said, at Wensley is quite incredible that it costs so much.
It is. It just, when you think of what the stipend that the vicar of that benefice must have been existing on when Wensley church was taken over by the Churches Conservation Trust.
Yeah.
And think of that sort of the scale of money.